Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jessica Jacobson, the Program Manager for Research and Insights here at the Skoll Center. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to our Insights for Action seminar series. Today, we're talking about how to center climate action in climate justice. We're going to be talking about some of the insights that have come out of the 2021 playbook, Climate Justice Playbook for Business, as well as insights coming out of research here at the University of Oxford, namely at Oxford Net Zero, but also here in the Said Business School. Just want to welcome our speakers. We have Raj Agrawal, who is the co-author of the Climate Justice Playbook. He's also the president of Provoke and the co-founder of the B Corp Climate Collective. Welcome, Raj. And we also have Dr. Jessica Omokuti, who's a research fellow on inclusive net zero. She works with Oxford Net Zero and the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society here in Oxford. And we have Professor Mariah Besharov, who is going to contribute to the conversation as well, drawing on her broader research. She's the academic director here at the Skoll Center and a professor in Said Business School. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel after for any of you who can't join today. And it's going to be a moderated conversation between the four of us. We will have some time for questions at the end, but if you have any questions during the talk, please put them in the Q&A chat function, just the normal chat function, and we'll pick them up. Also use the chat to introduce yourself, who you are, where you are in the world, what you're doing, any comments, any questions, and it'll be really interactive. Okay, so without further ado, before we get into the conversation, I wanted to hand over to Raj for a couple of minutes, who's going to share a few slides just to introduce the Climate Justice Playbook, what it is, what it's asking of business, and why the focus on justice in this conversation. So over to you, Raj.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Delight to be with you all today. I hope everybody's doing well. So as Jessica mentioned, the Climate Justice Playbook is something that we created in partnership with the amazing team at the Said Business School team who designed this, and Jessica and Zainab at the Skoll Center. We cannot thank you enough for your partnership and helping to co-author this document that we put out into the world. We're so privileged to work with such an esteemed institution and an entire community of global B Corps. And so the Climate Justice Playbook for Business is essentially a landscape analysis. Over the last couple of years, we've brought together a community of global B Corps that have really been thinking about collective action when it comes to climate. And we've helped them over the last 2 years, help to center, or at least to make an intention to center climate justice in their climate action. And in doing that, they realized that there was a lot that they didn't know, and that we wanted to understand where businesses were in order to help them understand where they could go. And we learned a lot during this entire process. I could say that even there was an entire learning journey around the development of the playbook itself and how others engage with the playbook and what we need to do next and what can inform future versions of this, as well as how we can actually get businesses to take the steps that are outlined in the playbook. And again, that too will be a learning journey as people progress along this new way or different way of approaching climate action. So let's go to the next slide. You know, we're really inspired by a quote from Audre Lorde that talks about there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And that's really at the crux of what we're talking about when we're thinking about centering climate action in climate justice. And let's go to the next slide. When we think about climate action, what we're really trying to, or climate justice, what we're really focusing on here is putting people first. So that's the real distinction here. You know, climate action has, as you all know, has a deep focus on carbon, but climate justice puts a focus on people first. It links human rights and sustainability, and it takes a human-centered approach towards climate action. And it focuses on the most vulnerable people who will be most affected by climate change first and worst, and are the ones who are least responsible for it. Let's go to the next slide. What we know is that, as you can see here from this slide, that what do we mean when we talk about first and worst? We see that climate change impacts are felt now. This isn't a future hypothetical situation. So many of us know that, maybe different people are experiencing it in different ways. And this is just a slide that talks about how climate change adversely affects the most marginalized communities around the world. And so when we take a climate justice approach and we center the needs of those that are most affected and allow them to lead the way on solutions, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But in the same way that any truly meaningful climate action places climate justice at the center, any meaningful climate justice work is centered in and led by those communities and people most impacted. So what are we talking about when we're talking about helping to do this? Well, let's go to the next slide. As we conducted our research, we noticed that to truly center climate action in climate justice required a significant mindset shift from where some approaches we have typically taken that feel essential are actually important to move away from. So this double-wheeled chart explains the transformation that we must go through as individuals, as companies, and society in order to realize true change. So for example, on the left side, you might see it might be really tempting to take a one-size-fits-all approach, as we often have to climate action, and to pursue our climate action in a way that focuses on deadlines and KPIs, and we expect the work to be linear. But instead, climate justice encourages us to take a different approach, one that values multidimensional thinking, deep listening, and is nonlinear, and instead is focusing on learning and progress. We'll often come back to this chart when we think about specific solutions in the realm of climate justice. So are the solutions and approaches focused on the right side of the chart, building an equitable and regenerative world, or how must we evolve our system from a broken system, which is on the virtuous cycle on the right, to the right? So we're really excited to be with you all today. One thing that I want to share is that, this was, again, a global collaboration, deeply involved with Oxford. Cannot thank you enough for working with us on this and this global group of B Corps. And I'll be able to come back and elaborate a little bit more on what does this mean for business.
Thank you so much, Raj, for that quick intro. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions about that, and we'll come back to it throughout the conversation. But I think a really good primer for those who haven't had a chance to read the full playbook. So thank you. Okay, well, a first question, for you and Jessica in particular, Jessica O, there are two Jessicas on this call, is, I'm really struck in that presentation about the importance of language and the power of language. And, justice sounds really good. But, really, what does it mean to both of you? And, how is it different than conversations about equity or inclusion or even, responsibility? And why the focus on justice? What's the added value there? Maybe Jessica, over to you first, and it'd be great to hear about this in the context of inclusive net zero and what that means. And then Raj, it'd be great to hear from you as well.
Thank you, Jessica. So where I usually start off by discussing equity as a broader framework for society. An equitable society is what we value most. It's where we want to go. And equity is basically where we make sure that those who need a lot of help get it the most. And usually when you talk about equity, it's equity versus equality. And equality is where everyone gets whatever, we get the same, while equity is if you need a bit more help, if you need to wake up a bit earlier to get there by 9 a.m., we will make sure that you wake up earlier. And those who don't need, the extra effort then can still wake up at 8:30 and still be there by 9 a.m. And creating an equitable society requires just approaches and just solutions. And so within equity are issues of climate justice or social justice, but also we have things such as environmental justice, and inclusion is kind of a process that helps us to get that. And so we may have justice that is not as inclusive. And so you use inclusion approaches to ensure that you have the right people in the room, you have the right approaches that actually identify the underlying drivers of, let's say, of marginalization, the underlying drivers of poverty. And so equity is kind of a broader framework. I kind of see it as a goal, an equitable society, and we use the different forms of justice. And as I mentioned, climate justice, we have environmental concerns, which can be addressed through environmental justice approaches to get to an equitable society.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Raj, I'd love to hear a bit more from you.
I actually have nothing to add. I was really lucky to be able to speak with Jessica earlier, and I think she's spoken really well to the points that she's even shared with me. So thank you.
Great. Okay. I'll move on then. One thing I'd really like to talk about is, how to do this work when it's such a complex, systemic, tricky area. And this idea of systems thinking is something we talk about a lot here at the Skoll Center. And I'd just love to hear, how, in order to build this climate just world that we're talking about, what systems work is necessary to get us there, and how can systems thinking, help us on that journey? Thinking about the different actors in a system, the different parts of this system, how do we do this? Question for Raj and Jessica.
Yeah, I'll start off on this one. Thank you. So, as I mentioned before in showing the playbook, that we talk about, there are no single issues, right? Everything is connected. And so climate justice is a systemic issue. We know that injustices are a result of multiple systems: the geopolitical system, capitalist system, white supremacist systems, economic systems, industries, food systems, the fashion industry. When we wrote the climate justice playbook to explore how the business community is tackling climate justice, we take a system view of how business systems can impact climate action and how we can root their practices in climate justice. So as we saw in the extractive to regenerative graphic, going from a siloed mindset to a multidimensional, systemic, and intersectional mindset thinking. So for example, in the playbook, we talked to over 50 businesses globally, and one of the businesses we talked to was a group called Pukka. They're a tea and herb company based in the UK. I love them so much. Natalie, who was been there, who just left recently, she actually grew up from many generations of farmers, and she really brought that insight into her work, right? And so what they found was that in doing their work, that they supported their suppliers, who are farmers, to diversify their plants to be more resilient to climate change. It's not something that Pukka wanted to do or invest in, but they needed to do it in order for them to make sure that their primary product was actually going to be able to sustain changes in climate change, right? And so they realized in doing this work that they can't only work on their own supply chain, but they have to think about all the farmers and all the sources of where these farmers are getting, for example, water. So when it comes to drought and irrigation, they need to work with all farmers on the land, not just the few that they work with, for the land that's connected to that particular river source. And they had to think about the farming system in that region as a whole. So there are a variety of ways in which, one thing that we really try to emphasize in the playbook is how businesses can collaborate with one another. And so you'll notice that one thing, for example, when Pukka did this work, and particularly in India, it not only helped them, but helped their competitors and other people that were also working with the same suppliers that they were. But we also know that this climate justice cannot be approached from just one business working with one community. We know that the individual actions of each business act as a jigsaw puzzle in a much broader picture of systemic change. And we need these businesses to recognize their connection to the wider systems in which they operate. For example, as I mentioned, the food system, the fashion industry, whatever industry they're part of, so they can activate change within the business. And so each business has stakeholders that it influences: customers, clients, suppliers, maybe even the retail outlets that it works with. They all have spheres of influences. Working on climate justice is all about collaboration with all those networks. It could be through marketing campaigns, educating your suppliers, or collaborating on different initiatives. And one other example that I want to share before I'd love to hear Jessica's thoughts on this is that we have another UK-based company called Danone. They're a large multinational, but they have a UK division. And then they also have another company called Ella's Kitchen, which could be considered a competitor. And both these groups make baby food. And so what they realized, what they really need to do was to tackle a local government recycling challenge that was really limiting both of their businesses' ability to responsibly recycle their products. And they were able to come together to address this governmental issue, even though that they're competitors. And so when we're thinking about climate justice issues, we're thinking about how, how like farmer livelihoods in the global South or waste systems in the global North all need to be considered with a systems thinking approach. And then, sorry, one last thing I want to say about this, which is I often think about interconnectedness and what we said earlier about how people that are most impacted by climate change are the ones that are least responsible for it. So that alone is an indication of how we're all working within the system, because somehow these people are, are most impacted by this. But Jessica, oh, and one last thing, in the playbook, you'll see we have a framework called Meta and MESO, and it really shows from the individual to the complex system, it actually shows the framework of how we're working within a complex system.
Thanks, Raj. I think that's really that's a really comprehensive explanation of why we need systems thinking. And I'll just add this. I like using analogies, and kind of 5 years ago, I worked on resilience in sub-Saharan Africa, and our job was to build resilience within communities, or to build resilient systems. And as Raj started off by mentioning, there's no single issue, and kind of that was reflected in our work when we acknowledged that when you're working with a household or a community to build their resilience, you cannot, you just don't assume that they're faced by one climate change risk. They are usually faced by so many risks or so many shocks. Some of them are climate, some of them are not. And as Raj mentioned, there's economic systems, there are social systems, political systems. And in this case, you'd find a household that is experiencing kind of recurrent droughts, but also outside of that, there's health issues that, in some cases are just have very little to do with climate change. And then there are, for example, a household member dies, and that is a risk that you really do not anticipate. And so creating a system, doing a systems approach makes sure that this household is able to withstand all those shocks and stresses. And that's what systems approaches do. And so they're able to kind of think about, if we invest in this aspect, what are the trade-offs? What does action in one area imply for other areas? If we helped, let's say, a household be resilient to floods, does that make them more vulnerable to let's say, droughts or changes in food prices? Or also, a systems approach also helps actions be much more cost effective, but also efficient, in a way that you're spending fewer resources. And because we live in a finite space where there's not enough money to respond to all the shocks in the world, and so you're much more efficient with your time, much more efficient with your money, but also much more efficient with more other resources. And so I think, as I said, a systems approach is important for understanding trade-offs, but also overlaps, win-win situations, but also for being more efficient with resources and more effective over time. Because obviously, if you implement actions that do not actually build resilience or do not protect communities from climate change, then you're more likely to lose much more than you anticipate.
Thanks so much, Raj and Jessica. And thanks, Kate, for the question in the chat. We'll come back to that at the end. And everyone else, please continue to put questions in there and we'll pick them up. Mariah, I'd love to bring you in and hear some of your reflections on this question of systems thinking, systems actors, collaboration. And we've been talking about two different ways of bringing in systems thinking. On the one hand, thinking about how climate overlaps with health systems, with economic systems, food systems, but also thinking about within the ecosystem of actors working for climate justice, who's in there and how does business relate to the other ones. And Mariah, I'd love to hear your reflections on sort of the ecosystem of actors and sort of where business fits in, thinking about your work on the Decisive Decade report, sort of competing demands that business is facing and sort of how they're collaborating and working in this space.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. And it's been great to hear the comments from Jessica, and Raj as well. I think the place I want to start is by picking up on something that Raj talked about in his opening, which is the mindset shift. And as we start to think about the role of business in this space, and really picking up on sort of the topic framing for our conversation, the climate justice playbook for business, right, and centering climate action and climate justice, and really the centrality of sort of a mindset shift in doing that. I think at a higher level, there's also just a mindset shift in having business, and this is starting to happen, but it's incredibly challenging, right, to have business start to think about from an ecosystem perspective, right, not just centering in on the organization's needs. And I think that's sort of a central theme that we've heard already in the discussion. And that's incredibly challenging, right? As individuals and as groups and organizations, we tend to be more comfortable with in many contexts, not all, but in many contexts, with the linear, with the unidimensional, with the clarity that comes with a singular focus rather than a multidimensional, more complex set of priorities, objectives, and needs to attend to. And so it really is very much a mindset shift that's required, not just to bring justice into climate action, but to bring business into more of an ecosystem approach. And it's a mindset shift for individuals, but then also for businesses as organizations, right? And the whole set of structures and processes and groups and collectives of individuals that go into any kind of large-scale organization. And so I think that's the point I want to underscore before I get into roles and sort of the different roles that businesses might play, is to even think about how to play, what those roles are and how to play some of them effectively. We really need to start to have this mindset shift. I think there's a lot of encouraging developments going on that suggest we're getting there. I was in a conversation on Wednesday at the business school, or had the honor of introducing a conversation on Wednesday at the business school between Paul Pullman, who's the chair of our board and also was the CEO of Unilever for 10 years and has been doing a lot of work in advocacy during and since that time to really talk about exactly these kinds of issues. And it starts very much as I've been saying, with the mindset shift of leaders and also of the sort of thinking about the role of business. And the other partner in that conversation was Colin Mayer, our former dean at Said, and now emeritus and also on the faculty at Blavatnik, who is emphasizing the other piece of that, which is thinking about sort of the role of business and how can, as organizations, businesses be an integral part, contributing part of shifting the ecosystem. And now to get to the roles piece, right, if we think about, okay, we've had that mindset shift, and not to trivialize that, that's a huge challenge. The roles piece, I think, is really thinking about that there are many different kinds of ways in which organizations in these ecosystems, in any one or the collective together, are contributing. And the whole value is in that there's no one organization that's doing it all, right? And so helping businesses to understand the interdependence and to make visible that interdependence, which I think is a lot of what we were hearing from Jessica and Raj, but also to understand how they can be a part of the solution, right? And we've heard some great examples already of that, of how businesses can help. And there are many different ways, right? So in the Decisive Decade report, we talk about 3 kinds of key activities that are needed for real systemic change. And one is a set of activities around highlighting the problems and bringing awareness to the problems and bringing information to bear, right? So this is sort of an activist role, but also can be an analyst role and a sort of an information and evidence sharing role. So there's really 2 pieces there. And then there's a whole set of activities and roles that organizations might play around connecting and orchestrating and convening, right? And this might be providing resources, it might be creating spaces for dialogue, it might be creating frameworks and standards, right? So again, within this set of orchestrating activities, there's a whole bunch of different specific roles that organizations can play. And then there's the doing piece, what we call the operationalizing piece. And this might be direct service, direct resource provision. This might be innovation in business models and products and services. And here too, there's many specific roles, but the idea of there needs to be an operationalizing component. And so businesses, like many other organizations, could be in all 3 of those arenas of activity, right? But they can't be in all at once doing it equally, and neither can any other player. And so the challenge is really to identify where, as a single organization, you're best suited to contribute, and to then forge those linkages with others. And I think Raj had already shared some nice examples of that.
Thank you so much, Mariah. I think that framing of those different kinds of action is really useful in this conversation. I just wonder, Raj or Jessica, if you wanted to respond at all, if that provoked anything in you that you'd like to respond to before I move on.
This is what happens when I teach and there's stunned silence after. No, I'm just joking.
I really appreciate Mariah. I have one of the next questions that we're going to be talking about is about what's the role of business. And so I feel like what you shared really reflects or why business in the first place. So I feel like, yeah, it just feeds into the rest of the conversation we're going to have. Thank you so much for sharing that. So maybe Jessica, I could kick it off into a little bit about why business.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're doing my job for me. Yeah, why business? We're talking about all of these different actors who are part of the change, but why start with business? Why focus on business? Why them?
Well, I really wanted to first acknowledge Mariah being like, oh, this is what it's like after she teaches. So I just wanted to be like, this is why I didn't have more to contribute at that time. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, businesses are the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases. It's like, that's like the simplest answer. And the fact is that we know that businesses have claimed or have poured tons of resources into addressing climate action. And I also know that nothing has really changed. I tell people I've been going to, climate things for at least 15 years, if not 20 or 25. And it's the same conversation of the same people doing the same thing. And it's like, we're like, I feel like the image that came to me is like, we're just driving off of a cliff and people keep on saying we're driving off a cliff and we're still heading towards the cliff. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think the Climate Justice Playbook talks a little bit about like the own personal work that we need to do to really understand how to address that, because it's such an overwhelming issue. But when we think about businesses, we know that, again, with what Mariah was saying too about, these businesses working together, understanding what their specific role is, how they can't be in one place at one time. What we also heard from a large multinational was that there's no way that they could actually go at this work alone. And when we asked them if we could quote them on that, they said that they didn't want us to include that quote because they didn't want to admit that. But that's what they told us. And so when we think about, what are these different places where businesses can play a role, whether they're a small business or a large business. I talked about Danone earlier and about Ella's Kitchen, but there was another company that came up, and we've had the opportunity to present on this playbook maybe 30 or 40 times since we launched it almost last year. Jessica, if you can believe that, it was January or February when we finally did this. And if it wasn't for your team, I could tell you that I would still be making changes to it to this day. Is that there was a group in Portland, Oregon, in the U.S. Called Taking Ownership, which what they do is they show up for their neighbors by helping their communities, helping Black communities primarily weatherize their homes. And there was another company that had billboards, these big signs in their communities. And so this small company, 1 or 2 person company that had these billboards, they're like, how can I help address climate justice? I'm such a small company. And what they ended up doing was providing free billboard space to this organization called Taking Ownership. And as a result, Taking Ownership got a lot more funding because they had greater visibility in the community. So this is where it's like really getting creative. Like, what can you do as a large organization? What can you do as a small organization? It can just vary so much. And I think that that's where people, like Mariah said, have to figure out like, what's the particular place where I can make a difference? And knowing that what you do in one part of wherever your sphere of influences might change based on where you are compared to what you do somewhere else. And that's the hardest part, I think, about this whole thing, is about that linear thinking. Business is like, okay, I'm going to apply resources to this specific thing. This is our strategy. We're going to do it. But to know that it's nuanced and we have to do different things in different places takes more effort, and maybe it takes more resources. Or it's like, maybe we're not going to do it globally, but we're going to do it in this specific place where we can make a real impact. Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, where do I start? So just adding on to what you said, yeah, so businesses are quite important. So it's just going back to the systems change. There's a business everywhere. There's a business created your road, a business built your house. Businesses are part of society, and if we're going to exact system change, then businesses are at the center of it. But also we need really radical change. As Raj mentioned earlier, we've been talking about climate change since the 1970s, and they started off, the global negotiations started off by saying that we're going for 1 degree, and then at one point they're like, yep, we're not doing that, let's go for 1.5, and then they realized, yep, we're not going to do that, so they went for 2. And so we need really radical change to take us back, to a space where we're comfortable, that we'll be able to live a very good life, a decent life for everyone, an equitable life for everyone. But then businesses are at the center of it, because obviously businesses are everywhere, but also businesses can push for the change in other places where there hasn't been much change. And so businesses in countries can push governments to make action. Businesses can push individuals to make action. And so we get that level of systems change that we need. But also another thing, I see businesses as really central in developing countries. And so they kind of act as the buffer between high level action and local level benefits. And so businesses translate investments into well-being outcomes. For example, if a government invests in healthcare provision, you see those outcomes through businesses. You see prices of commodities. When individuals get a bit of money, they put it back into businesses when they buy, let's say, flour, or they get clothes for their children. And so businesses are an indicator in a very neoliberal society. Businesses are an indicator of the health of a society, but also they channel investments to local levels. And so working with businesses makes sure that we're channeling our resources to improving the well-being of individuals, of communities and society. But then also I think working with businesses is quite important. And in this case, I'd like to kind of bring your attention to small and medium enterprises, because in most cases, when we're thinking about net zero, but also broader climate action, we forget about those very small businesses. And I think at this point, we need to think about what do we do to bring these businesses into these debates? What are we doing that is disadvantaging them? What can we do to accelerate action, but also what support do they need so that they're able to translate the benefits of climate action to local level communities?
Thank you so much, Raj and Jessica. Jessica, I have a follow-up question for you. I know that the focus today is on business, and that's what we're talking about, but I can't help but think about what you said about other actors and the relationship business has with, say, government or others. I'd love to just think about, what are the limitations? What can business not do here? And, when do we need to rely on actors like government or like civil society? And I know a lot of your work outside of the UK has looked to those other actors. And I'd love to just reflect for a moment about their role so that we don't, get in the trap of only thinking about business, which, like you say, can happen in this neoliberal framework.
Well, yeah, as you said, there's individuals, there's communities who actually implement actions, but also there's governments that create environmental regulatory frameworks for business to operate, but also they create policies, they set trajectories for action. And then we have civil society that advocates on behalf of the public, but also does the research. We have academic institutions. And so having these groups of actors working together towards a common goal is really important. And in most cases, we haven't seen that, particularly for climate action. We kind of see them pulling towards different directions. And it's kind of really until recently that we've seen businesses start jumping on board and start saying, well, now we need to do climate action. But still, that is still not, it's, we're seeing a very specific type of business that is coming on board. And my team, the team that works on inclusive net zero has observed that I work with has observed that it's a very specific type of businesses, but also we're seeing a very large number of actors that are still missing. For example, we have indigenous communities. The youth are also very, very, very skeptical about what role what climate action can we achieve. And so it's not just business, as you said, Jessica, it's about other actors and how we can enable businesses, but also how businesses can enable the other groups of actors to do their best in addressing climate change.
Thanks so much. Okay, well, I want to move on and talk a little bit about leadership, which I think all three of you have alluded to at various points in this conversation. And I think my question is, what does good leadership for climate justice look like? And I mean two things, in terms of representation, what does it look like? Who should be leaders in this space? Jessica, you mentioned youth, and I think at the moment we see some of the most exciting activism coming from youth around the world, and real leadership in that space, but also in terms of practices. So in terms of representation, practices, or maybe other lenses as well, what does good leadership look like here? And Raj and Jessica, I'd love to hear from you first.
Can I go first? Yeah, so I think leadership is being bold. And for climate action, we're in times that are unprecedented, and businesses have been in most cases, businesses have been very conservative about what they can do. But I think it's leadership is being bold and taking responsibility and doing more than what you want to do. It's taking greater responsibility and doing a bigger share so that you're giving others space. And in this case, I think I'm talking about this in relation to climate change, so just stepping back a bit, the current governance of climate change is very non-binding in a way that, you make commitments, and then we'll be very happy when you say that you reduce your emissions by, let's say, 20% by 2030. And if you don't do it, we'll be like, it's okay, we understand, times were tough, now go on and do better. And so it's a system that's based on name and shame. And name and shaming means that people will make commitments and then they will do it, and then they'll go out and announce it. They'll be very showy about it. They'll put out posters. And usually they just do the bare minimum. But I think leadership for businesses is going further than that, because for us to really address climate change, we'll need to bring a very huge proportion of the world out of poverty. And we need to kind of get them above the poverty line and take them further, because it's really not okay for people to just barely survive. In different parts of the world, there's people who are just one disaster away from falling back into poverty. And that's not a good life to live. And so we need to build a world where people are 6 disasters away from poverty. And doing that means that some businesses, some countries will need to reduce their emissions much more, so that some countries or some businesses, some communities have a bit more space to emit just a bit more, so that they can go past the poverty line and do a bit more than that, have a car, have a fridge, have good food, not have to rely on, have to eat a few proteins a week. And so doing that means that businesses will have to take greater responsibility, and doing that is investing more into emission reductions, but also supporting people to come out of poverty. And so it's kind of a very humanitarian approach, humanity, putting people before profit, thinking about what do we need to do in the short term, but also what do we need to do in the long term to limit warming according to, to kind of align that with the science targets. Raj?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I have questions for you, but I will try to answer the main question first, which is what is leadership? And so, we see leadership in that graph that you saw in the chart as the green behaviors on the wheel. That's on the right side. Not really being limited by linear thinking or assuming we have all the answers. We've had the opportunity to do a lot of work on what takes CEOs and other groups, other people that are in leadership positions to shift. And it really is about being with their peers and seeing them make changes to the way that they think about business culture. And so another way that they can do that is passing the mic. With Pukka, we talked about their farmer voice and having that lead where they make their investments. When we talk with a group called Seventh Generation, they use their blog to feature activists. And it's all about, what we often encourage is how can they use their platforms to pass the mic to these folks. When we did the Climate Justice Playbook, we were really focused on businesses, and it was right about this time last year, and we realized that we had not centered the voices of the people that we were saying who had to be centered. So we spent the next 1 month trying to incorporate those voices into what we were doing. Kind of like in hindsight, we had fallen into the same trap that we said we shouldn't do in the first place. So we had to that's where we were on our own learning journey around that. And now we're in a process of getting feedback from climate justice experts on these recommendations, because what we're hoping to do is to create a year-long learning journey for businesses where they're learning from frontline climate justice experts on what it means to center climate justice in their climate action work. And so part of that is also in passing the mic, we're asking to amplify the strong voices that are out there. Like, who can we learn from? Another company, Patagonia, one of the largest outdoor companies in the world, they work really strongly with the Gwich'in people in Alaska. And instead of, speaking on their behalf, they asked the Gwich'in people, what story do you want to tell? And they talked to Bernadette Dementov, who's the director of the Gwich'in steering people in Alaska. And when she shared that what this work is for her, they shared with us that this work isn't activism. This is work that they are doing to preserve their way of life. And so we might come from an academic lens or from a business lens or from an activism lens. And really hear what Jessica is really saying is that this is about people's lives and not about some other pursuit. I think leadership is really about listening. It's about putting these people first and letting them lead the way in creating solutions. And as I mentioned before, in response to one of Mariah's things, is leadership is really having the confidence and the courage to take a look at oneself, right? We're really understanding what our own eco-anxiety is, why we're allowing these things to happen, understanding how climate change impacts ourselves, our family, our loved ones. And it also, and actually I have nothing else to add beyond that. Jessica spoke about how it's about being bold and about speaking out. And I think it's about humility, understanding that we can't do this alone.
Raj, I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question about passing the mic, that idea of drawing on other forms of expertise in this work. And as you know, this really resonates with a lot of work we're doing at the Skoll Center around centering different forms of knowledge and expertise in the conversations that we're having around systems change. And a lot of this is in partnership with the Center for Knowledge Equity, who are really leading this work here in the UK. And, the idea is that, you bring different forms of expertise, and one of those is lived experience, right? So what you've learned through your own life, your own experiences, sometimes at the hard edge of injustice or discrimination. And I just wanted to say, beyond passing the mic, what are some of the ways to offer leadership and voice and decision-making power to those other experts beyond just having a platform, in terms of being on boards or being shareholders in some capacity? Are there any other really good practices when we think about leadership in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's anything more than what I've shared, so I can try and maybe hopefully I'm still answering the question, which is, in the case of Pukka, or we've even heard with examples with the ice cream company Ben and Jerry's here in the US, is that when they decide where they're going to make an impact, they go into the community, they ask the folks within the community what they want them to do, and then it's done. This isn't a negotiation, this isn't a conversation, it's really relinquishing power and providing the resources that you do have to those groups to say, how are we going to address this climate change issue in your community? So boards are great, blogs are great, but it's like, have them use the resources in the way that they know how to best address their problem, because they've been watching it happen in their community for potentially decades or generations. And it's really interesting to see power shift that way when you have people that have gone through more traditional forms of knowledge attainment to learn from people that have had lived experience. Everybody benefits from that.
Thanks so much, Raj. Mariah, I'd love to hear some of your reflections on what good leadership looks like in this space. I know you've done a ton of work with businesses, looking at sort of within organizations and between organizations, how people are leading this change. I'd love to hear sort of what works, what doesn't work. Any reflections from you?
Great, thank you, Jessica. I want to pick up on a few points from Jessica O and Raj about courage and about mindset and giving voice at passing the mic, which I think is all sort of wonderful ways to think about this kind of work. And I think, maybe I'll start where Jessica started with the courage piece, right? I think it takes, courage is sort of central and in two ways, right? One is the boldness and the sort of, we're going to step up, but the other is we're going to step back, right? And we're going to pass the mic, we're going to give voice to others. And that takes, in today's world, and especially in many business circles, right, that takes a lot of courage. And so being able to do that, right, to both sort of be bold about the commitments and the ambition and the aspiration, but also to be bold and courageous in saying, we're going to invite others, not just invite others into the conversation, but give them a voice, follow their lead, right? So it's not just who's at the table, right, and who has a voice, but sort of who's really in the lead of sort of, and has influence and power in this conversation and in decisions. And so, that I think that takes a lot of courage, and so that's central in many ways. And that takes also, then, to pick up on one of the things that Raj said, that takes a lot of inner work, right? As a leader, as an individual, to be able to do that and to be comfortable with that. Again, in many of the business contexts in which we're talking about, right? That is not the dominant model of what a leader does. Right, a leader doesn't step back and pass the mic, right? In many contexts, that's not how leadership is viewed, even today, right? Even as many of us are talking about this, it's still not the dominant model. And so you really need to sort of look inward and gain comfort and confidence from your own experiences, right? And then have the courage to really go out and do that. I think then, of course, sort of the inviting in many voices, passing the mic, right? Then there is a need, right, to sort of have a coherence, to sort of have this holding together, right, as you sort of invite more voices and more dispersed sources of influence and power, right? There is a need for collectively, but still facilitated by a leader, creating a shared narrative, a shared vision, a shared ambition, and articulating that, right? But it can't come from one person alone or one organization alone. So there is an aspect of bringing together around a shared narrative. And that also requires, again, as more voices come in, more sources of power and expertise are recognized, building trust, right, between people coming from very, very different perspectives and angles and views on the problem, and many perhaps very different agendas. And so the sort of the common narrative and then a basis of trust are both really important pieces once you start to pass the mic and open things up. And then the third piece, building on those two, is something that Jessica mentioned, which is really about accountability, right? So not just making commitments and not being held to them, but finding ways to hold oneself and one's partners in this sort of journey of systems change, to hold people accountable. So there is in some ways still sort of a sharp edge to this, right? As much as there is a bringing together and a sort of a collective effort, right? There needs to be also accountability, particularly, I think, on businesses as they enter this space more and more.
Thanks so much, Mariah. Okay, before I go into my final question, just another offer to anyone in the room. If you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat. If you're shy, you can send them to me privately and I can read them out. We will have a little bit of time at the end, so please send them my way. And then a final question from me. We're still fresh out of COP26, which I think, sort of captured our hopes and imaginations in this space over the past few months. And I'd love to hear from all of you, but especially Raj and Jessica, who I think were sort of involved in COP in different ways, sort of, in relation to climate justice in particular, what are your reflections on the commitments and plans coming out of COP26? Any sparks of hope that we should be paying attention to? Any areas of disappointment? And we also had a question from one participant about the SDGs. an existing set of commitments that we're already working towards, and how we can get back on track for those, as we're also thinking about new commitments coming out of COP. Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I'll go first. So I was at the COP, and one thing my feeling for the COP was that it was very showy again, a lot of commitments, with very little discussions about how are you going to achieve those commitments. And so we had businesses, we have governments, we have different people saying that we'll reduce our emissions by this much. But then people who actually know what this means would say that, well, there's really no evidence to show that, you've provided very little evidence to show that you'll achieve those commitments. And so it's more of making pledges and bigger announcements as opposed to how we'll achieve them. And my concern with that, my biggest issue with that is that we're running out of time. And running out of time means that we keep doing this. I mean, COP27 is coming up. We'll have a few more people make more pledges. And then before we know it, will be in 2030, we'll have a temperature warming of 1.3 or 1.4. And then in a few more years, we'll be at 1.5. And then by then, a few small islands will have been lost. A few vegetations or a few species will have gone extinct, and then and that's kind of normalized, and then life goes on. And so my worry is that we'll have a lot of these paying lip service at these global events, and mostly the thing is they overlook the effects. They overlook those who are really, really affected by climate change. For example, we have the small island states kind of just concede and say that we're not happy with the outcome, but we have to do this because we realize that it's the best we're going to get at this point. And having people concede is kind of saying that we're defeated. We don't think there's any other way for us to pursue better outcomes for climate change. And so the COP was more disappointing for those who are really affected by climate change, as Raj mentioned earlier. And thing is, if we continue on this path, there's really no climate justice. And I think what we need to do is kind of see how we can pursue climate justice outside of these very high level spaces, and think about how do we implement actions at the national level, but also at the local level within communities. And one thing I'll mention is that to achieve the goals of limiting emissions, we'll need to kind of also support adaptation, like I mentioned earlier, and businesses will be asked to do much, much more, taking on a greater responsibility. And to do that, we kind of really need to move away from the large businesses, as I said, the multinationals, and start thinking about what else can we get the smaller businesses within countries to do? What can we get the national banks, the local banks, the women's funds? What can we get them to do to get these targets being achieved? And one way to do that is by education, because trust me, there's a lot of people out there who are asking, what exactly is climate change? And then even further than that is, what exactly is net zero? And so when bigger corporations are making commitments on reducing their emissions, they are committing smaller businesses to that, because these smaller businesses are part of their supply chains. And when you get committed to a goal that you don't even know why it's there, then it's kind of creating a space where there's just no understanding. And so we need to do a lot of awareness for smaller businesses to get them to understand why bigger businesses are making these commitments and how they can get bigger businesses to achieve these goals, but also to get them to make their own goals, to think about why they need to think about why they need to reduce their emissions, but also to have a very people-centric approach to businesses.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And just to say, for anyone who didn't see it, Jessica did speak on a panel at COP26, and you can find that online. It was fantastic, I think, with the Body Shop. Raj, from you, any further reflections? And what we're really looking for here as well after that, I mean, Jessica, I agree with everything you said, but any sparks of hope that we can look towards in these commitments at all?
I thank you, Jessica, for all that. Building on what Mariah said too, businesses have the ability to shape cultural narratives and norms about human behaviors. And so what we did see that was positive, which was very little, was how central climate justice was in the narrative at Glasgow. And so since COP, many more businesses are asking what they can do to advance climate justice. We were able to share the playbook at the UN Women's COP event. and help to galvanize more interest. So just like we're able to do today, we're definitely galvanizing more interest, but it really speaks to Jessica's point. Like we have to look at the small, medium-sized businesses. We have to look at community solutions. We really just can't be dependent on these larger, government organizations to actually do what we need to do.
And just to add here, I mean, so I'm not saying that it's, there's quite a lot of hope. One thing I've learned growing up in a developing country is that every little bit counts. You know how they say that wealth, there's cross-generational wealth. Like if your dad was wealthy, you're more likely to be wealthy, and then your children will not have to work. It's kind of the same for poverty. And so if your parents did not go to school, the poverty is also likely to be kind of translated across generations. And so if businesses invest in reducing poverty, even for a household or for a generation, then they're more able to affect future generations. And so you're reducing the chances of future generations falling into poverty, or you're increasing the chances of future generations living a very kind of fulfilling life. And that is something. And so every small investment counts. And I think businesses should focus on that, because what I realize is businesses are more, they're interested in what legacy they build, because businesses look at the long term. And so that is a legacy that businesses can focus on, supporting communities, supporting households, supporting individuals to achieve their best, but also to live very good, fulfilling lives.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I'm aware we're almost at time, and thanks, Kate, for that last question about greenwashing, and Mariah for your response. Before I wrap up at the end, Raj, I'd love to ask you as a closing, if you have any calls to action, any ways that you'd really encourage people on this call to use the Climate Justice Playbook in their work. I mean, I can see we have people from business, we have professors and teachers, we have students. We've got a real mix of people here who can go and download this report now. Is there any calls to action for how they should use this going forward?
I think that with where it is and where we are in this process, the more that people can download it and share it with others, to really start educating themselves on where business is overall. And I would say that the playbook, even though it's called the playbook, has more questions than answers. And so going through the inquiry of these insights, these obstacles, these questions, and particularly on the self-reflection component, because that's the courage it's going to take to really be able to tackle these issues and speak to them in the way that Jessica and Mariah have enlightened us today.
Great, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank all of our speakers again. Thanks so much, Raj, Jessica, Mariah, and thanks everyone for being in the room and for your questions. I just wanted to say we're continuing the conversation next month. So we have one of these seminars every month during term time here in Oxford. And next month, we're deepening the conversation on leadership and net zero. So we'll be speaking to other colleagues from across the university, really thinking about leadership needed to achieve net zero commitments. So I hope all of you here today will join us then to continue the conversation. Thank you so much for joining. Please do download the playbook and read it in its entirety. And I hope you all have a really good holiday break and New Year, and we'll see you in January. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jessica, for convening us and moderating. And thank you, Raj and Jessica O, for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.